Good morning, everyone. Today I want to talk about the history of Lloyd's of London. I want to tell it as the story of how a coffee shop gradually turned into one of the most famous insurance markets in the world. When people hear the name Lloyd's, they often think it is just one insurance company, but it is actually much more than that. It grew as a marketplace where people came together to share information, judge risks, and insure all kinds of things. Its story begins in a very practical way. People needed reliable news, and they needed financial protection when business went wrong. In a time when ships could disappear, cargo could be stolen, and voyages could fail for many reasons, merchants wanted some way to spread the danger. Lloyd's became the place where this happened. Over time, it moved far beyond ships and trade. It adapted to industrial change, global wars, new technologies, natural disasters, climate concerns, and even space. So the history of Lloyd's is not only about insurance. It is also about how business communities respond to uncertainty. It shows how trust, information, reputation, and adaptation can build an institution that lasts for more than 3 centuries. To understand the beginning, we need to go back to 17th century London, when coffee first arrived in Britain. Coffee houses soon became popular places for people who wanted to meet, talk, exchange news, and do business. After the Great Fire of London destroyed much of the city, these coffee houses became even more important because they gave traders and merchants somewhere to reconnect and keep commerce moving. One of these places was Edward Lloyd's Coffee House. It was not originally designed to create a global insurance market. It was simply a practical meeting place in a busy commercial world. But it had one big advantage: it became known for reliable shipping news. Ship owners, captains, and merchants all wanted updates on departures, arrivals, cargo, routes, storms, pirates, and war. In a trading nation that depended heavily on the sea, that kind of information was valuable. Soon, business people started using tables in the coffee house to arrange insurance for ships and cargo. If a voyage failed, the financial loss could be devastating, so people were willing to pay others to share some of that risk. In this way, a social space slowly became a business hub. Lloyd started with coffee and conversation, but underneath that was something serious: the need to manage danger in a world that depended on trade. By the late 17th century, Lloyd's had become well known enough to be mentioned publicly, and it developed a clear identity among the many coffee houses in London. There were dozens of such places, but each tended to attract its own crowd. Lloyd's became the one associated with shipping and marine business. It drew in ship owners, merchants, and people returning from voyages overseas. This specialization mattered because it helped Lloyd's stand out. It was not trying to be everything for everyone. Instead, it became the place where people connected to maritime trade could gather, compare information, and make deals. One of the most important practices at Lloyd's was the selling of insurance for ships that might not return. That may sound simple now, but at the time it was a major innovation in business practice. It meant loss did not have to destroy one person completely. It could be shared among several people willing to take on part of the risk. Lloyd's also moved to Lombard Street, right in the heart of London's business world, which helped it become even more central to finance and trade. This move shows that Lloyd's was no longer just an interesting coffee shop. It was becoming part of the commercial machinery of the city. Reputation, location, and useful information all worked together to push it forward. One of the things that made Lloyd's especially powerful was not just insurance itself, but information. In the 18th century, information about shipping could make or lose fortunes. Lloyd's built its reputation by collecting and sharing news that merchants trusted. A key example is Lloyd's List, which began as a publication offering regular shipping intelligence. It told subscribers about ship departures and arrivals, what cargo ships carried, where fleets were operating, and even where pirates had been seen. In a world with no internet, no live tracking, and no instant communication, this was incredibly valuable. The people paying for this service were not doing so out of curiosity. They needed the information to make decisions about trade, investment, and risk. Lloyd's became known as a place where the news was dependable, and that kind of trust is hard to build. Its maritime intelligence became so respected that it reached the highest levels of government. There was even a point when news connected to British naval success was delivered from Lloyd's to Downing Street. That tells us Lloyd's was not just serving private business. It had become important to national interests as well. So when we look at early Lloyd's, we should not imagine only contracts and premiums. We should also imagine maps, routes, rumors, intelligence, and the constant search for accurate news in an uncertain world. As Lloyd's grew, it also became more organized. Early on, people would informally agree to insure risks, but over time the market began to take on a clearer structure. We see signs of this in the development of subscriptions, where individuals effectively joined and paid to participate in the market. This helped turn Lloyd's from a casual gathering place into a more formal commercial community. It also helped shape the culture of the institution. Membership, contribution, and participation began to matter more. People were not just dropping by for coffee and gossip anymore. They were becoming part of a system with recognized practices and expectations. This period also matters because it laid the foundations for what later became the Lloyd's subscription market, where multiple underwriters could take shares of one risk. That idea remains central to Lloyd's identity even now. Another major development came through law. Insurance disputes began to go through the courts, and some of these cases helped define what counted as acceptable practice. One famous case established the principle that a ship had to be seaworthy before it left port. If it was already in a bad condition, then insurers could refuse to pay. That may sound obvious today, but at the time it was a crucial legal standard. It showed that insurance could not simply reward poor judgment. So even at this relatively early stage, Lloyd's was not only growing in size, it was also helping shape the rules of risk. Growth, however, did not happen in a smooth or perfect line. Lloyd's also faced problems with reputation, and one of the most interesting moments in its history came when some underwriters wanted to separate themselves from less respectable behavior. There had been concern that certain kinds of business at Lloyd's looked too speculative, almost like gambling rather than serious underwriting. In response, a group of professional underwriters broke away and established what became known as New Lloyd's. This was a major step because it showed that the market understood the importance of trust and discipline. If insurance starts to look reckless, then confidence disappears. And without confidence, no insurance market can function for long. New Lloyd's eventually replaced the old version and became a stronger symbol of order and professionalism. Around this time, new customs and practices also developed. One influential figure, John Julius Angerstein, helped create the idea of a lead underwriter, meaning one underwriter would set the terms and others would follow. That helped bring more structure and efficiency to the process. At the same time, this era also reminds us that some wealth linked to Lloyd's came from the economics of empire and slavery. That is an uncomfortable but important truth. Institutions that lasted for centuries were often shaped by systems of power and exploitation as well as innovation. So the rise of Lloyd's includes both professional progress and moral complexity, and both need to be recognized. By the late 18th century, Lloyd's was evolving into something much more formal and recognizable. The subscribers moved into new premises at the Royal Exchange, showing that Lloyd's had become a serious institution at the center of British commercial life. During this period, traditions emerged that still carry symbolic importance today. One example is the Lloyd's Lost Book, which recorded the details of lost ships. Even now, the idea of writing down losses in a central place reflects something essential about insurance. The business is built not only on success and profit, but also on the public recognition of disaster. Lloyd's also demonstrated just how advanced its intelligence network had become. In one case, it reported the capture of a British vessel by a French privateer before the Admiralty even knew the event had happened. That tells us Lloyd's had become both a private marketplace and a national information asset. Its relationship with the Admiralty became mutually useful. Lloyd's provided intelligence, while the Navy provided protection on the seas. This close connection to maritime power helped Lloyd's grow even further. Around the same time, The market also played a visible role in national life by raising money after the Battle of the Nile and presenting a silver service to Nelson. These acts made Lloyd's look not only commercially important but publicly patriotic. It was increasingly woven into the identity of Britain as a trading and naval power. One of the most famous stories from this era is the loss of HMS Lutein in 1799. The story has become almost legendary in Lloyd's history, and for good reason. The ship was carrying a huge amount of gold and silver bullion that had been collected by City of London merchants to support Hamburg during a time of economic crisis. But the Lutein ran into a violent storm, went aground, and sank, taking the crew and treasure with it. Lloyd's underwriters had insured the cargo, and the claim was paid in full. That detail is important. It showed that Lloyd's was prepared to honour enormous losses when the policy required it. Later, the Lutein bell was recovered from the wreck and returned to Lloyd's, where it became one of the market's best-known symbols. Traditionally, it was rung to signal important news about ships, once for loss and twice for safe return. Today it is used only on ceremonial occasions, but its presence still connects the modern market to its maritime past. The Lutein story captures many things at once: the danger of sea trade, the global scale of finance, the importance of honouring claims, and the way Lloyd's turned dramatic events into lasting traditions. It is a reminder that the history of insurance is full of human stories, not just legal documents and financial calculations. The early 19th century brought even more change because Britain was living through war, industrial expansion, and wider global trade. The Napoleonic Wars had a huge effect on maritime insurance, and Lloyd's, as the leading marine insurance market in London, was deeply tied to the outcome of those conflicts. War increased uncertainty, but it also created business, because more ships, goods, and voyages needed protection. During this time, Lloyd's prospered. Insurance rates rose, profits were strong, and underwriters benefited from the movement of goods and the wider wartime economy. Lloyd's also built strong ties with the Royal Navy and established the Patriotic Fund, which still supports members of the armed forces and their families. This shows how Lloyd's connected commercial success with public and charitable roles. Another important development came in 1811 with the creation of Lloyd's Agency Network. This was a global system of appointed agents who sent back local information to London. It dramatically increased the speed and reach of Lloyd's intelligence gathering. In many ways, this network helped turn Lloyd's from a mainly London-based market into a truly international one. The market could now receive news from many more places, and that meant better judgment of risks, quicker responses, and greater confidence in overseas business. Information had always mattered to Lloyd's, but the agency system made it global. As the 19th century moved on, Lloyd's had to deal with fresh pressures from competition and from wider changes in the insurance industry. At one point, the market went through a difficult period and lost some prestige. New laws allowed broader competition, which meant Lloyd's could no longer rely only on its old status. But rather than disappearing, it reformed and adapted. Leadership became especially important here. George Richard Robinson, as chairman, helped restore confidence and reputation. Other useful changes also happened around this time. Stamp duty on policies was reduced, Lloyd's List became a daily paper, Lloyd's Register was founded, and the agency system kept expanding. These may sound like administrative details, but together they show how Lloyd's modernized itself. The market was learning that survival depended not only on history and prestige, but also on practical improvements. Another striking feature of this period was Lloyd's investment in communication technology. Reports were gathered through coastal semaphore signal stations, allowing information to travel from ship to shore faster than before. This sounds almost quaint now, but at the time it was cutting-edge business infrastructure. Lloyd's understood something very early: whoever gets reliable information first has an advantage. The market's history is therefore not just about ensuring risk after the fact. It is also about constantly improving the systems that help people understand risk before disaster strikes. The 19th century also saw Lloyd's become more secure and more ambitious. One important step was the introduction of stronger financial expectations for underwriters. New candidates were required to provide deposits or guarantees to support their business. This was a practical move to build trust. People buying insurance needed confidence that those promising to pay claims would actually have the means to do so. Around the same time, innovations in market structure began to increase Lloyd's capacity. A major figure here was Frederick Martin, who promoted the idea of larger syndicates. Before that, many syndicates were very small, with only a few members, and Lloyd's risk capacity was therefore limited compared with larger insurance companies. Martin changed that by writing for a much bigger syndicate, showing that Lloyd's could take on larger lines of business. This helped the market compete more effectively. Then came the first Lloyd's Act in 1871, which was a turning point. It formally incorporated the Society of Lloyd's and established a detailed constitution. It also made it illegal for anyone who was not an authorized underwriting member to sign a Lloyd's policy. In other words, Lloyd's was becoming a regulated institution, not just a famous meeting place. The law recognized its economic importance. That legal recognition helped strengthen the market's identity, its boundaries, and its authority in the wider world of commerce and finance. Another reason Lloyd's became so influential was that it developed a reputation for paying claims promptly, even across borders. A good example is the Boston Fire of 1872, after which Lloyd's paid a very large sum in claims and was widely admired in America for doing so quickly. That kind of response mattered because insurance depends on trust more than almost any other business. People buy a promise, not a product they can hold in their hand. If the promise fails when disaster comes, the whole system loses credibility. Lloyd's understood this. It also broadened its operations in important ways. Under Henry Hosier, overseas claims could be settled in foreign ports for the first time, making the market more flexible and international. Hosier also embraced new communication methods, including telegraphy, because he saw the business value of fast information. Lloyd's therefore kept strengthening both its operational reach and its reputation for reliability. Around this same period, another giant of Lloyd's history emerged, Cuthbert Heath. He would later become famous for helping move Lloyd's beyond marine insurance into many new areas. Heath is often remembered as a visionary because he saw that the world was changing and that Lloyd's needed to change with it. His career marked a transition. Lloyd's was no longer only about ships and cargo. It was starting to insure a much wider range of human activity, and that shift would transform its future. Cuthbert Heath is one of the most important people in the story because he helped drag Lloyd's into the modern age. He introduced non-marine insurance to the market and pushed Lloyd's into new areas that others might have thought too unusual or too risky. He wrote policies covering burglary, hurricanes, earthquakes, and later became involved in early aviation insurance. This matters because it shows a major change in mindset. Lloyd's was no longer tied only to the sea. It was beginning to insure the broader hazards of an industrial, urban, and technological society. Heath also expanded Lloyd's internationally through delegated authority, allowing trusted agents in other countries to write business on his behalf. That was the beginning of a system that let Lloyd's reach customers far beyond London without requiring every deal to happen face-to-face in the underwriting room. At the same time, Lloyd's also moved into the world of motor insurance. When the first motor policies were written, cars were so new that the documents reportedly described them as ships traveling on land. That detail is amusing, but it captures the strange moment when old insurance language had to stretch to fit new inventions. Lloyd succeeded because it kept doing that, using old experience to handle new realities. The market's history is really a history of adaptation. It survived because it kept expanding its idea of what could be insured as society itself changed. The early 20th century tested Lloyd's in dramatic ways. One major event was the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which caused massive destruction and led to huge claims. Cuthbert Heath's response became famous. He instructed his local agent to pay policyholders in full, regardless of the exact wording of the policies. That decision was costly, but it helped cement Lloyd's reputation for honor and reliability. Sometimes a market strengthens itself not by saving money, but by showing clearly what kind of institution it wants to be. The earthquake also pushed forward ideas about modern risk modeling and building practice, because people began to see more clearly how catastrophe losses worked. Around the same time, Lloyd's also moved into aviation insurance, another example of its willingness to engage with emerging technologies. Early aviation was risky and unstable, and business in that line stopped and started more than once. Even so, Lloyd's kept exploring it. Then came the Titanic in 1912, one of the most famous insured losses in history. The ship had been insured at Lloyd's for a huge sum, and when it sank on its maiden voyage, the claims were paid in full within a month. That quick payment again reinforced Lloyd's image as a market that honored its obligations. Disasters were terrible human events, but they also became defining tests of an insurer's character. The period of the First World War and the years after it showed that Lloyd's was not separate from world events. It was deeply affected by them. Many men from Lloyd's entered military service during the war, and the institution also supported war-related charities and families of soldiers and sailors through its patriotic fund. Some employees returned after the war, but many did not, and memorials at Lloyd's remember those losses. Insurance markets are often described in financial terms, but they are also communities made up of real people, and war made that painfully clear. At the same time, Lloyd's kept engaging with new risks. In the years after the war, it insured airships and other aviation ventures, some of which ended badly. There was a lot of excitement about the future of air travel, but also repeated crashes and failures. Lloyd's had to learn, sometimes painfully, how to price and manage these new dangers. Another major step came in 1923 with the creation of the Central Fund after serious underwriting debts created a crisis. The principle was simple but powerful. If one underwriter or syndicate failed, there would be a shared fund to protect claimants and support the market's reputation. This idea of mutual protection strengthened Lloyd's from within. It recognized that the failure of one part of the market could damage confidence in the whole. That was a modern lesson, and Lloyd's took it seriously. Lloyd's physical and symbolic identity also changed in the interwar years and during the Second World War. In 1928, the Society moved into the first building it had ever owned on Leadenhall Street. Owning its own building was more than a practical matter. It was a sign of confidence, permanence, and maturity. Lloyd's was not just renting space in someone else's world anymore. It had become a major institution with its own home. Then came the Second World War, and once again Lloyd's had to adapt under pressure. The building's basements were reinforced for protection, staff were moved to safer locations, and even people from London's East End were given shelter. What is striking is that business continued despite the bombing and chaos. That continuity matters because insurance has a vital social role during crisis. When war disrupts normal life, people still need claims handled, risks managed, and systems kept functioning. Lloyd's showed resilience in very difficult conditions. After the war, the world changed again, and Lloyd's history touched broader social developments too. A small but notable example comes from the American Civil Rights Movement. When African Americans in Montgomery organized carpools during the bus boycott and traditional insurers canceled their cover, a black broker arranged support through Lloyd's. This episode reminds us that insurance is not just an abstract financial service. It can affect whether social action, mobility, and collective resilience are even possible in practice. From the 1960s onward, Lloyd's entered what we might call the age of modern risk. The world was changing fast. Electronics, telecommunications, computing, and space technology created new possibilities, but also new kinds of danger. Lloyd's once again tried to stay ahead of the curve. In 1965, it provided pioneering insurance for satellites, covering physical damage before launch. That is an extraordinary contrast with its origins in coffeehouse discussions about ships and cargo. The same market that once tracked pirates and sea routes was now insuring objects going into space. This ability to follow human progress into new frontiers is one of the most remarkable things about Lloyd's. Social change also appeared inside the market itself. In the 1970s, Lloyd saw the arrival of its first female broker and then its first black broker in the underwriting room. These were important milestones in a place that had long been dominated by a fairly narrow professional elite. Progress in representation was slow, but it mattered. Then in 1986, Lloyd's moved into its striking new building, designed by Richard Rogers. The building's inside-out design made it an architectural landmark and symbolized something about the institution too, a willingness to appear modern, bold, and different. Yet just as Lloyd's projected confidence through architecture and expansion, it was about to enter one of the hardest periods in its history. The late 1980s were deeply traumatic for Lloyd's. A series of severe losses brought the market close to collapse. The Piper Alpha disaster in 1987, the costliest man-made catastrophe in insurance at the time, was one part of the story. But the bigger problem was the combined impact of many different claims, including asbestos, pollution, health hazards, oil, wind, and fire losses. The scale of these liabilities was enormous, and many names, the individual members who backed Lloyd's underwriting, were left facing devastating losses. Some people's personal finances were ruined. This period shattered the idea that Lloyd's historic prestige alone could protect it. It exposed weaknesses in governance, oversight, and risk control. The crisis was not only financial. It was also reputational and emotional. A market that had survived wars and disasters suddenly looked fragile from within. Yet this period also forced hard reform. Out of the crisis came reconstruction and renewal in the 1990s under Sir David Rowland. This program helped modernize the market, close down old liabilities, and rebuild confidence. Corporate members were introduced, which changed the capital base and made the system less dependent on private individuals. Reinsurance arrangements and settlement proposals gradually helped bring one of the darkest chapters to a close. Lloyd survived, but not by pretending nothing was wrong. It survived by confronting the damage and redesigning itself. After that painful recovery, Lloyd's became much more focused on structured risk management and realism. One important development was the introduction of frameworks like realistic disaster scenarios, which required syndicates to show that they understood their possible exposures to major catastrophes. In simpler terms, Lloyd's were saying, do not just hope for the best, prove that you have thought seriously about the worst. That approach reflected lessons learned from the losses of the late 20th century. The market also continued opening itself up socially. In 1996, Mel Goddard became the first female active underwriter at Lloyd's, which was a significant step in a market that had for so long been overwhelmingly male in leadership roles. Internationally, Lloyd's kept expanding as well. Lloyd's Asia opened in Singapore in 1999 and became a key regional hub, showing that the market's future was increasingly global, not simply centered on London. Then came the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. These attacks changed the way the world thought about risk, security, and large-scale loss. They also produced Lloyd's biggest ever single loss at that time. Once again, the market responded by paying out billions and handling major claims for affected businesses. Events like 9/11 remind us that insurance is tightly linked to world history. When a society experiences a shock, insurers are among the institutions that must absorb, measure, and respond to the damage. Lloyd's role therefore remained central, even as the nature of risk kept changing. The early 2000s also highlighted how climate and catastrophe were becoming central to the insurance world. A severe hurricane season in 2004 and 2005 brought major losses, especially in the United States, including the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina. Lloyd's responded quickly, settling claims and sending loss adjusters to the affected region. That responsiveness mattered not only commercially but socially. After a disaster, money for rebuilding cannot remain stuck in theory. It has to move. Insurance becomes meaningful only when the claims process works in practice. Beyond claims handling, these years pushed the market further into catastrophe modeling and scientific analysis. Lloyd's had long combined practical judgment with experience, but increasingly it also needed sophisticated models to understand large-scale weather, flood, storm, and earthquake risks. The market's history shows a steady movement from intuition and merchant knowledge toward more formal data-driven systems. In 2007, Lloyd's became a founding member of ClimateWise, which signaled that climate change was no longer a side issue. It had become central to long-term risk thinking. Then came Deepwater Horizon in 2010 and the catastrophic run of natural events in 2011, including floods, earthquakes, tsunamis, and storms. These were costly years, but they also accelerated learning. They pushed the industry to refine how it models extreme events and how it understands the growing connection between environment, infrastructure, and financial loss. Social change within Lloyd's continued alongside these shifts in risk thinking. In 2014, Inga Beale became the first female CEO of Lloyd's, a milestone that carried both symbolic and practical importance. It showed that an institution with deep historical traditions could still change its leadership culture. That same period also saw stronger public discussion about inclusion and diversity. Lloyd's launched initiatives aimed at creating a more open culture, reflecting wider social expectations that major institutions should not remain exclusive clubs. At the same time, the market was thinking more deeply about climate responsibility. In 2015, Mark Carney spoke at Lloyd's and stressed that insurers had strong reasons, both commercial and moral, to understand and address climate change. That was an important message because insurers sit in a unique position. They do not just talk about future risks, they price them. If climate risk grows, insurers feel it directly. Around the same time, Lloyd's research suggested that many major urban risks around the world were now linked to human-made threats such as cyber attacks, terrorism, market crashes, nuclear accidents, and climate change. In other words, modern danger was no longer mainly about natural events or isolated accidents. It was increasingly systemic, interconnected, and shaped by human decisions. This was a big shift in perspective. Lloyd's was not simply covering ships, buildings, or vehicles. It was increasingly involved in understanding how fragile, complex modern societies could be. From 2016 onward, Lloyd's entered a new phase focused on transformation, resilience, and digital change. One major step was the launch of electronic placement, which helped modernize how business was done in the London market. That may sound technical, but it represented something larger. Lloyd's was trying to move away from older paper-heavy systems toward a more efficient and connected future. Lloyd's also expanded its diversity work through the Global Dive-In initiative and created Lloyd's Lab, a space designed to encourage innovation, experimentation, and new product development. This was important because the market recognized that being old and respected was not enough. It had to remain inventive. There was also the creation of Lloyd's Europe after Brexit, which showed the institution trying to preserve access and continuity for its European clients and partners. Then came the Future at Lloyd's strategy, which aimed to build a more advanced insurance marketplace. Part of that included the Syndicate in a Box program, designed to make it easier for innovative new businesses and new talent to enter the market. This is an interesting twist in Lloyd's story. A market that once grew through informal coffeehouse participation was now deliberately designing structures to welcome new entrants again, though in a much more formal way. Renewal, it seems, has always been part of Lloyd's survival strategy. The year 2020 tested Lloyd's, like much of the world, in a completely different way. The COVID-19 pandemic created disruption on a global scale and forced institutions to adapt very quickly. Lloyd's had to support customers facing unprecedented claims and uncertainty, and for the first time in its history, the underwriting room had to close temporarily. That fact alone is symbolic. A market so tied to physical presence, tradition, and face-to-face exchange suddenly had to operate under conditions where that was impossible. Yet business continued, and Lloyd's expected billions in pandemic-related claims while also donating money to charities linked to healthcare, well-being, and innovation. The pandemic also sharpened awareness of systemic risk. Lloyd's launched FutureSet as a platform for sharing ideas and expertise on major global threats, especially those linked to climate change and wider uncertainty. At the same time, Lloyd's confronted its own past more directly. In 2020, It issued an apology for its historical connections to the transatlantic slave trade and committed to further research and to addressing racial inequality in the present. That matters because institutions with long histories do not only inherit prestige. They also inherit responsibilities. Looking honestly at the past is part of building credibility in the present. So 2020 was not only a year of crisis response. It was also a year of reflection, reform, and moral reckoning. In recent years, Lloyd's has continued trying to present itself as a market focused on resilience, inclusion, sustainability, and global problem-solving. It published its first ESG report, linking its future more explicitly to environmental, social, and governance goals. It also helped launch initiatives related to vaccine transport, climate-vulnerable countries, and sustainable markets. These projects suggest that Lloyd's wants to be seen not only as a place that pays claims after something goes wrong, but also as a platform that helps society prepare for large-scale challenges before they become disasters. There were also symbolic moments that showed cultural change inside the institution, such as the first female liveried waiter making an official entry in the Lost Book. On the international side, Lloyd's moved quickly in response to the disruption caused by the war in Ukraine, helping support grain shipments and reduce the risk of a wider humanitarian crisis. It has also become involved in discussions about space debris and the sustainability of satellite expansion, which again shows the market following human risk into new frontiers. Most recently, Lloyd's launched a private impact fund aimed at investing in areas such as climate mitigation, adaptation, the circular economy, and social inclusion. Whether every initiative succeeds is another question, but the direction is clear. Lloyd's wants to position itself as an insurer for a world facing deep, connected, global risks. So when we step back and look at the whole history, what do we actually see? We see an institution that began with coffee, conversation, and shipping news, then grew into a marketplace for sharing financial risk on a global scale. We see that its strength has always depended on a few core things: information, trust, reputation, flexibility, and the willingness to change. We also see that Lloyd's story is not simply one of smooth progress. It includes war, empire, slavery, speculation, scandal, financial crisis, and painful reform. That is important because long-lived institutions are rarely pure success stories. They are usually mixtures of innovation and failure, pride and contradiction. Still, Lloyd survived because it kept learning. It moved from marine insurance to motor, aviation, catastrophe, terrorism, cyber, climate, and even space-related risks. It adapted to new technologies and new expectations. It also gradually changed socially, opening doors that had long been closed. In many ways, the history of Lloyd's is a history of how modern societies deal with uncertainty. Every age has its own dangers, but people keep looking for ways to understand them, price them, and survive them. Lloyd's became one of the places where that work happened. And that is why its story still matters today, far beyond the walls of London's insurance market.